turn to a case that you probably haven't been following, which is the United States versus Google, an antitrust case against Google that the Department of Justice is seeking to break apart Google, stripping away its Chrome browser and potentially its Android operating system business, among other draconian provisions, as my next guest talks about it. So last Friday, May 9th, the U.S. District Court for D.C. heard closing arguments in that case. So joining me now is Patrick Hedger, the NetChoice Director of Policy. And so this is a really important case, Patrick, not just obviously for Google, but I think overall for U.S. policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission broadly, when they approach antitrust, are kind of following down the path that we see the Europeans taking and targeting American tech companies for really, as you said, draconian provisions that I worry is going to chill investment and innovation in a sector that we really cannot afford to fall behind on. Because the Europeans, their approach to antitrust has not produced any sort of major technology company. They regulate too much over there. I worry we're heading down that same path, and that'll put us behind the Chinese, which we really cannot afford.
And so antitrust as an overall issue, is a federal issue constitutionally. So let's, for those who maybe have a more surface view of what that is legally, can you describe kind of what that is more broadly in terms of policy and where it should be as contrasted to maybe, where it is in this case?
Yeah. So antitrust is an old body of law that dates back to the 1800s, and it's really about ensuring competitive marketplaces. And generally, you would see things that are pretty clear antitrust violations, right? If a bunch of companies get together and they all decide to agree on one price and nobody's going to charge more, nobody's going to charge less, that would be price fixing, right? So that's an antitrust violation. So, or a company that has truly no competitors and is beginning to abuse that and charging higher prices and otherwise harming consumers, that would be something that antitrust law is designed to deal with. But looking at Google, when this case was launched, after this case against Google was filed, OpenAI launched ChatGPT, which is the biggest competitive threat Google has faced probably in its existence. And so the market is showing us that there is competition, but nonetheless, the government is still pursuing this antitrust case against Google.
And interesting that, we're talking about antitrust in the midst of President Trump signing this executive order that's basically price fixing pharmaceuticals. And a lot of conservatives, I think, are concerned that, if this were a big pharma doing this, then the DOJ might have concerns on antitrust. But when it's the executive doing it, then somehow conservatives should be okay with that. Well, that may be a conversation for another day. But President Trump has set out an ambitious agenda to usher in a new golden age for American innovation. And so his focus on deregulation and eliminating government waste and with DOJ and all of that are good endeavors. But how does this particular case in the Justice Department's angle look to perhaps threaten that agenda and maybe be at cross purposes?
Yeah. And I think your previous point is well taken. And unfortunately, where you end up seeing most things that would, otherwise constitute an antitrust violation, right? Market concentration, price fixing, tend to emanate from government. And some of the things that are being pursued here by the Department of Justice could potentially grow competitors to Google that are even bigger than Google. If they force Google to sell Android or sell Chrome, the only companies that are going to be able to afford those products and those services are companies that are as big, if not bigger, than Google. So, I'm not really sure how this is a productive endeavor for the government, but I also worry because Google just announced they've made a major investment to launch 3 nuclear sites here in the United States. President Trump has been very serious about, hey, we need new nuclear power generation, and Google is driving on that. President Trump has emphasized the importance of artificial intelligence. Google is a major investor in AI, including its own companies and other companies as well. And also robotics is something that often gets overlooked. That's one area where the Chinese are unfortunately actually ahead of us. Right? We still have a nice lead on AI, but On robotics, the Chinese are ahead of us, and Google is a major investor in Waymo, which is a driverless car technology, but that's fundamentally robotics technology. So I would hate to see those investments discounted when they're so critical to keeping the U.S. ahead of China.
And I'm speaking with Patrick Hedger, who is the Director of Policy for NetChoice, and you can follow him and also NetChoice on X. I'd encourage you to do that. And, it's interesting that while Google is very much invested in AI, and so is the Trump administration. I mean, that has been a main focus for his Digital Bill of Rights. It's been a main focus with J.D. Vance even talking abroad about that. It's been very critical that we stay ahead in the United States in terms of policy. So overall, why would Trump's DOJ then take this type of position with Google when ultimately it could have an impact on not only the AI race, if you will, but also even American digital security?
Yeah, I think there's lingering resentment over conservatives being targeted on social media and feeling like they're being targeted by big tech. And what we have found is that a lot of that stemmed from government putting pressure on these companies. And I think it's a really bad path to head down when, if government is the problem, to introduce more government as the solution. What we need to be doing is something like what President Trump signed into an executive order, which is going after the ability of government to pressure technology companies to take down conservative speech. And then I think we need to codify that, right? So it needs to go beyond an executive order. It needs to be signed into law, because executive orders, of course, can be undone. Rand Paul has a bill that would do that. I think that's where you need to start to address these issues. Breaking apart companies because they didn't moderate content or host speech that the government does or does not like is a really, really dangerous precedent. We can't be using antitrust law to go around the First Amendment.
That's an excellent point. And so where is the case currently situated then, with closing arguments having been on Friday? What is at issue in terms of breaking apart Google? And is this something that ultimately the federal judge will determine?
Yeah, so right now we're effectively at the sentencing portion of this trial, but the original trial itself, the finding of guilt, if you will, is going to be appealed. So we're probably a couple of years away from anything ever being settled because of this appeals process. So there is time for the Trump administration to try and strike a deal here that will be in the best interest of the country. But again, breaking off big parts of Google and potentially selling them to the highest bidder, which could be a bigger company than Google, is not the right path to go down. So, I mean, this is really what we're looking at here. What the DOJ is asking for is like a prison sentence for a traffic infraction. Justice has to be proportional, and right now we're not seeing that.
Wow. And is there a potential that if some of these parts are broken off and sold to the highest bidder, could that potentially include any foreign owned entities, or would that be strictly limited to American domestic companies or entities?
Yeah, I'm not sure there are any foreign companies that are large enough to acquire some of these assets, but the really concerning thing is something else that the Department of Justice is asking for would be for Google to basically make its data behind its search engine, right? Its secret recipe available for any potential competitor that comes along, and that could include foreign companies. And what's really concerning about that is that would include personal data of Google users. I don't know about you. I use Google, and that means I've chosen to use Google. And I don't think it's fair for the government to come along and say, well, you chose to use Google, but because we're going to give your data to a competitor because we want Google to have more competition. I mean, that's a huge cybersecurity and privacy risk that's all entangled in this as well.
And conservatives generally, Patrick, would not be in favor of government intervening in the free market in that way. And so it seems to not just be at cross purposes with Trump's agenda, but overall the conservative movement to have the DOJ take this type of stance. And you mentioned previously that Congress should be codifying some of these things. And I'm left kind of wondering, where is Congress in this mix? Because all we're hearing in the news is about, Trump issuing executive orders like today. But Congress really hasn't moved fast on any of this, or it seems like they're not even focused on any of this. Where overall should conservatives view this rather than just saying, well, if Trump's DOJ is after this, then it must be good conservative policy? I think we need to take a more critical view than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen this sort of lurch on the right of conservatives beginning to embrace antitrust against what they perceive to be political enemies. And I think that's a really dangerous road to go down, because that sets really nasty precedents for the left to do the same thing someday. We can't be using antitrust to, again, circumnavigate the First Amendment and go after perceived bias, because the left will have a field day with things like that, going after companies that they perceive to be conservative someday. That's why we need to make sure that antitrust stays very much so in a objective standard, right? Is this company too big? Is this company harming consumers? Not, do we like this company's politics? So that's something that conservatives need to be backing. But Congress also, some things that Congress can do is look at, making some of the regulatory changes the Trump administration is doing permanent, so that it's easier for new companies to come up and compete with big companies, right? Competition is the best solution to any of these problems. And we need to be looking at, instead of trying to go after the branches of these issues, right, go after the root. And right now it feels like we're just trying to, cut around the edge and, go after companies out of convenience versus doing the hard work of addressing competitive issues broadly.
Really well said. And so I'm speaking with Patrick Hedger, who's the Director of Policy for NetChoice. You can find out more about them at netchoice.org. And in just the last minute or so I have with you, so let's talk about NetChoice and why this policy overall matters, and what you all do, how people can perhaps get involved more if this is an issue that rightly they think concerns them.
Yeah, absolutely. NetChoice, we're an organization that promotes free enterprise and free expression online and in technology policy broadly. We ultimately believe capitalism and free markets and free speech are things that make America the world leader in technology, as we've seen over the last several decades. And we're on a mission to preserve that as we get into new competitive spaces like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and robotics, and things like that, these frontier technologies. So you can find us at netchoice.org and follow us on X at NetChoice.
All right. Well, Patrick, I really appreciate your insights. I think this is a fascinating topic, and just reinforces the understanding that just because it's the Trump administration doing something, or just because it's a Democrat doing something else, we as conservatives always need to go back to our policy framework and ultimately our principles and what does make America great, which includes free market capitalism.